Amen. Just before I start, as I was preparing this sermon, I kept having this strange feeling that I've told you before, the story I'm about to tell you. But if that's the case, just pretend that you've never heard it before. But I want to tell you that not much more than a year after getting married in our early 20s, Jason and I packed up most of what we owned, put our huge dog in the backseat of the car, and headed for Massachusetts. I had been accepted to seminary there, and we were off for a new adventure. And it was magical, if not a little bit disoriented, to be moving into this new chapter of shared life at the same time we were settling down in a completely new place where we knew no one and nothing of the surrounding culture. Being so unfamiliar with New England and not knowing how long we would be there, one of our priorities was to get to know not only Boston, but also the surrounding areas as well. And we found that one of the best ways to do that was on 2 wheels. We got an amazing little guide that details the 100 best cycling routes in Massachusetts. And every other week or so, we would pick one, put our bikes on the car carrier, and head off to some town that we'd never heard of and couldn't pronounce to put in 40 or 50 miles of exploration. This was before GPS, so we would photocopy the pages of the book that were germane to that ride, and we would keep them in our jersey pocket and then take them out and look at them and unfold them. Okay, now go 0.3 miles north and turn left on Homestead Road, and then go 3.4 miles and turn right. Oh, wait, was it left or right back there? This kind of thing. And there were each and every one of them amazing adventures as we pedaled through the rolling hills of Lexington and Concord, circumnavigated Massachusetts' best apple orchards, stopping to enjoy more than our share of cider donuts, and enjoyed the breathtaking coastline of the state's renowned South Shore. And we got lost and found our way again and learned to co-navigate life as much as our bike routes. But one trip that stays alive in our family lore more than the others was a particular trip that we took exploring some of the smaller towns along the coast just north of Boston, its illustrious North Shore. Now, by way of setting the scene, I should say that many of these trips we took were in the summertime, being that cycling in Massachusetts in the winter presents some complications. If you've ever tried, you know it's difficult to ride a road bike in 18 inches of snow. But if you've ever spent time on the East Coast, you also know that summers can present equally meteorological intensity in the form of really hot, oppressively humid days. And it was on one of those horribly sticky days that we went to explore the North Shore by bike. And somehow, I'm not sure how, given the demonstration I've just offered during the children's time, we didn't bring enough water bottles with us. Which meant that partway through the trip, what felt like about mile 100, even though it was probably about 24, all of our water bottles were bone dry. And we kept pressing on as the heat kept pressing down, but at some point I just got so thirsty. And being the very well-balanced, not at all melodramatic person that I am, I called out to Jason, who was a little bit ahead of me, "Stop!" He kind of made a little U-turn and circled back. "What's wrong?" he said. I said, "We have to stop. We're out of water." To which he responded very calmly, "Yes, how will stopping help us?" I mean, there's one thing we could ask. We were standing in the middle of a hot, sunny road. I said I didn't know, but I knew that I was hot, and I knew that I was thirsty, and I was just not feeling particularly well equipped to keep on going. This was, again, as the not melodramatic person, now this was, I had decided, the hill, quite literally, that I was going to die on here on the side of the road. Now, to be clear, we were in the middle of a fairly well-populated suburb at this moment, so it is unlikely that our lives were actually in danger, as there were many passers-by, willing neighbors, and garden hoses close at hand. But none of that entered my consciousness in this moment. Only my thirst did. Eventually, after a short meditative break in which no tears were shed, Jason convinced me to go just a little bit further and see if the route would lead us onto a shadier path. And it actually didn't. However, about 1 mile later, we came over the crest of a hill, and I saw something ahead of us that engendered within me a feeling of almost apocalyptic hope. There it was on the horizon, a bright, gleaming, 7-Eleven. And I will tell you that the Gatorade I drank that day was like no other Gatorade you have ever tasted. It was like lemon lime manna from heaven, the true living water. And we still talk about that time and joke when God put a 7-Eleven in our path in the hour of need. Which is all to say, I don't have any trouble really getting right into either of the stories that we've heard today from the scriptures about thirst. I don't have any trouble imagining how a lack of water could create a quarrel between the people and Moses and the people and God. More so than my coastal suburb experience, thirst in the desert is no laughing matter. And I don't have any trouble imagining how just a short stint of it in a dry place could make the memory of enslavement's provision loom large and tinged with nostalgia. When we have a need that needs meeting, it can grow to fill every corner of our consciousness, pushing out any illusions of faithfulness or devotion. I don't have any trouble seeing that. I also don't have any trouble picturing the scene from our gospel text today in which Jesus and this nameless woman meet at the well. It was noon, we were told by John, the heat of the day. And you know, much has been made about this interaction and about the woman's identity at the center of this story. A Samaritan, a foreigner, 5 husbands living with another, gossips take notice. What drove her to the well at this particular moment is typically the question a preacher will pose. Was it her own shame and desire to avoid others that had her there at noon rather than the cool morning hours? I should say I've given a dozen of those sermons myself, probing the idiosyncrasies of this woman's story. But now I sort of recognize that in a way, those are all just attempts to distance ourselves from her. And that really those details don't matter so much as this one. She came to the well because she was thirsty. And here's something else. So did Jesus. That's what I find so intriguing about this selection, reading it now, that we get so hyped up, hypothesizing about why the woman was there in the heat of the day, that we forget that Jesus was there in the heat of the day too. And for all intents and purposes, he doesn't appear to have gone there to seek out wayward women in need of proselytizing. John tells us why he was there. He was tired from his journey, and he needed some water. And we don't think about him as some weirdo camped out beside the fountain at an odd hour. And I think there's something in there. The fact that they both came there for the same reason. Will you give me a drink? It's a question that works both ways. I love how the imagery been offered today, it gets at that, right? This mutuality of their exchange in this moment. Will you give me a drink from Jesus to the woman and the woman to him? There's something there. Like the idea that their thirst was what brought them together, their need for real, live, regular water. But that something about that meeting then allowed this conversation between them to unfold, the one about the living water and the good news of God's everlasting provision. You know, I notice that always seems to be happening for Jesus. Like he's just wandering around, kind of living into his humanness and his hunger and his thirst and connecting with other people in theirs. And it seems that so often when we read the Gospels, it's that initial spark of relationship that allows the more holy exchange, the higher wisdom to unfold, the thing that leaves them all truly and eternally satisfied. And I wonder if that means something for us. You know, I was thinking, I wonder if it means that the threshold over which we step to come into God's presence must be one that takes into account our very real needs. That in some way we're meant to bear our hungers into the community of faith, many of whom have the same wants. And that we're meant to do that not only to solve them, but because bringing them to light is part of what helps us find entree into a greater awareness of the God who meets our needs. I think this is why some of the greatest mystics and theologians of our tradition have said that it is impossible to be a Christian alone. I mean, I wonder if this isn't why after the resurrection, in the very earliest days of the faith, before the word Christian or church even existed, what the followers of Jesus thought to do to connect with him was to sit down for a meal together. That's the only idea I had. Let's sit down for a meal together. They didn't have hymns or prayers of confession or offering or doxology. They had their own hungers, which they brought together, and then they broke bread and ate. And in eating, they connected with each other, and in connecting, they invited the Spirit's presence to be with them, and that Spirit built them up. Now, maybe that sounds a little bit too abstract for you. Let me say it a different way. I think we have to be able to answer the question I asked at the beginning: what brought you in today? I think it's an important spiritual discipline to be able to speak our hungers aloud. God, I'm thirsty. God, my stomach is rumbling. God, my soul is parched. God, I am hungering for companionship. God, I am tired from my journey. God, I am starved for hope. God, I am craving purpose. God, I long for direction. God, I am low on certainty and not sure I can go on. I think this story points us in the direction of the fact that we have to keep connected to all those very real needs. Because somehow it's how we connect to God, who we know through the incarnation in Jesus chose to share those needs too. So what better place to find God than in them, where God has chosen to find us? And I think meeting there, we're able to open to God's living word, reach the vista that helps us to see how God's wondrous provision might be made known in your own life. So if I were to give you a homework assignment on this day, it would not be only make sure to bring enough water for your journey, but what brought you here today? Do you have an answer to that? Can you think about that, what that might be? Can you think about whether you'd be brave to share it with one other person after this service is done? What brought you here? While you're thinking about that, I want to tell you one more thing before we close, and that is just something I've been thinking about. I wonder how our work of mission might look a little different if it were based in stories like this one about the Samaritan woman, where she and Jesus seem to be in kind of an equal exchange, right? He says, I'm going to give you some water. She says, with what bucket? You know, they're on an equal playing field, kind of exchanging these ideas. You know, and I know that in this wing of the church, and by that I mean progressive Protestantism, we tend to have a very philanthropic practice of mission and service. Let me find someone who has a need and give them something that I have that they don't have. But there are all sorts of different kinds of visions of mission. One of them, which comes to us from the world of community organizing, which emphasizes self-development, involves identifying the things that we need the most, identifying the deepest hungers of our hearts and our families, and then asking our neighbors what they most need, and finding some common ground to work together to build solutions to those needs. For example, we need safety in our neighborhood. I bet if we went out and asked our neighbors, even our houseless neighbors, they would tell us that's what they need the most too. Somewhere to feel secure, somewhere to stay safe. So if we asked for those stories and we kind of started meeting together, we might figure out how to collaborate on some mutual solutions, right? It's a slightly different vision because it starts not when we go looking for needs, it starts when we identify our own. It starts when we meet at the well because we are all thirsty and recognize each other's vulnerability and dignity in that act. It starts when we both arrive at the same place and through that build awareness and action, which just helps us move over the crest of the hill to find the living water of justice and peace that Jesus promised with his life and with his death and with his resurrection. So offer those questions and reflections to you that they might feed your soul today and draw us closer together for the work of pursuing God's Spirit. And I ask that God add a blessing to these words, the God who has created, redeemed, and sustained us always. Amen.